All right. Good afternoon, everybody on the East Coast. Good morning to my other central time zone folks, and even earlier for those out west of me. Get started here in just a minute. So my name is Jason Cook. I work in commercial insurance, and I specialize in insuring businesses in the beverage industry. So breweries and distilleries and wineries and all that good stuff. My focus area within that really is mostly on breweries. So I'm excited to have the opportunity here to talk to you a bit. I know that insurance is not fun or sexy, so I probably won't take all 45 minutes. So I'll try to make it as quick and easy to digest for you guys as I can. If there, please feel free to ask questions on the chat. I'm happy to answer them as we go, and of course we'll have some Q&A at the end. But a lot of times this goes a little bit smoother if it's a bit of a dialogue rather than me just talking at you about work comp for a period of time. So feel free to dive in. So let's go ahead and get rolling. So I want to start by thanking all of the sponsors for the conference. First of all, thanking Andrew for putting this on. I don't know how he manages to put all of this together. It is a lot of different people and a lot of technology all coming together, and it's a pretty neat resource, both for brewers and for folks like me that work kind of tangential to the industry. So thank you to him, and of course thank you to the sponsors for helping make it happen, because it wouldn't without him. So. And I think River Drive Cooperage is our sponsor for this particular day, so special thanks to them. So here's what hoping to talk about today. Do a brief introduction, kind of tell you a little bit about myself, about my agency, and then we'll take just a high-level look at the work comp mistakes that I'll talk about, and then we'll kind of dive into the details on it. So first of all, about kind of the agency, about myself. I'm not going to drone on about the agency. If you really want to know about us, you can send me an email, or you can kind of Google us. But IMA is the name of our agency. My business unit within that is IMA Select, which is a business unit that is focusing on small commercial. So we handle basically companies that go up to, say, $250,000 a year in insurance spend. And so the vast majority of breweries fall within that realm. And we do work with a handful of larger ones in a different business unit, but that falls to my purview. So I think the most important thing I would say about our agency that I guess I'm most proud of is that we are employee owned. And that means a couple of things for you as a client, that anytime you're working with an associate within our agency, you could well be working with an owner, people that are invested in your success and giving you kind of the best of themselves. And the other thing is being employee owned, we're not subject to shareholders, so we typically invest a lot more money in our associates and the community. We typically strive for a 15% profit margin, where a lot of agencies are shooting for 25. And there's a picture of my ugly mug there enjoying a beer. Yay. So here are the common mistakes that I want to talk to you about today. And I guess before we dive into these, holistically looking at work comp insurance. So unlike some other coverages that you may get as a brewery, workers' compensation is a statutory coverage, meaning that in most states, there are some exceptions, Texas in a way, workers' compensation is mandated by law. And workers' compensation is a state regulated industry. So every state, unfortunately, is different. Um, and what that means is every state, that mandate, that threshold is a little bit different depending on the state that you're in. So just for instance, with Missouri, given that that's the state I'm most familiar with it being right in my back door, our backyard, they mandate that once you have 5 employees, you've got to carry workers' compensation unless you're a contractor, but then you've the threshold is 1. So anyway, that's something that's important to consider, is that you run into, if you don't carry workers' compensation, you're setting yourself up for potentially fees from the state. The other thing to consider with workers' compensation is that theoretically the damages for workers' compensation are infinite. So if you have an employee who has a head injury, and goes in, is in a coma for 9 months, right? Those expenses, it doesn't matter what they accrue to. Those expenses fall either on your workers' compensation carrier, or if you don't have work comp, they fall on you. So um, it's not the most fun of subjects, but it is necessary. And so I think it's important to kind of talk through it. So these 5 items here that you're looking at are the most common, I think, misconceptions, misunderstandings that a brewery has as far as workers' compensation. So let's dive right in. So safety culture. So these 5, by the way, are not in any particular order. I think they all have at least some level of importance. I think safety culture, however, though, has to be the most important out of any of these things. And I think that's just the foundational nature of safety. It transcends everything about your business, not just insurance, not just work comp and the expense that you have for work comp. But if you don't have a safety culture, you're going to have a lot of issues. And it is no surprise to me when I meet with prospects and I meet with clients, and if I can tell that they're doing things the right way in their brewery, they're probably going to be really good clients for me too. It's just an indication that they're running their ship the right way. So safety culture, I'm not gonna get too far into safety culture because some of that is outside of my purview. If you really need help establishing and developing a safety culture, there are some things that I can help with, certainly from the insurance carrier side. So a lot of carriers will provide their online portals will give you plenty of help as far as like building out safety plans, providing incident report forms, providing advice as far as incident reporting to the carrier, et cetera. So there are resources that are available there. But I would encourage you, if you feel like your safety culture is inadequate, you really should hire a professional consultant to help you with that piece of it. But the reason why I mention it here is the other pieces really become somewhat irrelevant if you can't get this part right. This is where you start. So we'll keep it moving. So this is one of the kind of 5 levels here where it's a work comp mistake, but really the mistakes are made mostly on the agent side. What you can control as a brewery owner is properly vetting your insurance professional, making sure that number one, that they're competent, but that they also have some experience within the industry. So what I find a lot of times when I'm working with clients that I'm onboarding, or if I'm talking just to prospects about their workers' compensation, is that a lot of times the agents they could be a mom and pop agent who doesn't have a lot of access to different carriers. So as an independent agent, we have contract appointments with a ton of different insurance companies, and the value to that is having really just more tools, right? To say, well, this carrier works in these situations, this carrier works in others, et cetera. So sometimes you might run into an agent that just doesn't have market access, but you might also run into an agent that just doesn't know what they're doing. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there aren't a lot of agents out there that don't know what they're doing. But The risk you run here, there's a couple of things. So on the list that I put here, so sometimes if they put you with the wrong carrier, that can cause a number of complications for you. Work comp coverage is very straightforward. It's kind of one of those is what it is. It is a no fault coverage. And so it doesn't matter how a worker gets injured. It doesn't matter if the worker is a moron. It doesn't matter if the owner is negligent or management is negligent. If a worker gets hurt on the job, there's coverage. So there's no risk here as far as being with the wrong carrier, as far as not having coverage, but the risk you run is having complications at renewal. You may well be with a carrier that has no real appetite for a brewery, and the agent has put you with them by mistake. The pricing could be totally off. The other piece that you see often done incorrectly is classifying payroll. There are a few classifications for those of you that have looked at your work comp policies. There's a few classifications that you typically see with a brewery, and that's the codes are 2121 for your brewery folks, 8810 for clerical, and where you see, and those are usually pretty straightforward, but where you see a lot of misclassifications are between 9082 and 9084. And I didn't write this stuff down because I didn't want to get too far into the weeds with that. But the important thing is that one of those class codes is for restaurants, not otherwise classified, and bars and discotheques. Most agents will defer to placing their brewery clients in that bar and discotheque classification, and that's wrong. And this is just one of the many items where it's important that you have an agent that actually understands your industry, because just the agent is important in being able to understand your industry and tell the right narrative to an underwriter to get proper coverage and to get proper pricing. But at the same time, the agent has to know those things, because the pricing for a bar is higher than the pricing for a restaurant. And if you have enough payroll in your tap room, that can make a pretty big difference on your premium. And if the agent thinks that you're a bar, because if you look at a tap room heavy brewery, 80, 90 to 100% of their sales in black and white may be alcohol sales. And so an inexperienced agent or underwriter says, well, that's a bar, and it's just not true. The other thing you see a lot is just poor advice, generally speaking. There was an instance in one thread on the Craft Beer Professionals Facebook group where an agent had told, not on there, the brewery owner had been told by their agent offline that they needed to include tips into their payroll calculation, and that's wrong. Tips don't get included, and it doesn't serve you to include tips, because you're just increasing your premium for no coverage advantage at all. So the only other piece I'd talk about is the member inclusion exclusion errors. So depending upon the state that you're in, and depending upon your legal entity, whether you're an LLC, whether you're a corporation, you can potentially include or exclude LLC members or corporate officers from coverage. And that just needs to be a conversation, I think, with your insurance professional as to what your duties are as an owner. Are you purely clerical? Are you brewing? Do you have health insurance? Do you have disability insurance? Are you actually going to file a claim? Maybe you will, maybe you won't as the owner. So it's just a part of a conversation. And a lot of times I find that there's been no thought or intention has been put into whether or not an owner or officer is included or excluded. So let's keep on moving. So poor record keeping. This is something that you see a lot with breweries that have let's say food trucks, for instance. And so a state like Kansas is a really good example for kind of heavy food truck use, in the sense that the food truck sales are ran through the brewery's point of sale. And so from a from a revenue standpoint and a payroll standpoint, what it appears to be on paper is essentially a subcontractor that is preparing food. In reality, they're an entirely separate entity that's doing their own operations. They cook the food, they serve it. So it's important to, and this also bleeds over to general liability, but it's important to collect certificates of insurance from those vendors, whether or not they're going through your POS or not. If they're going through your POS, it's extremely critical because, as you know, if you've already had a work comp policy, or if you will find out if you're a brewery in planning, work comp policies are auditable. And so at the end of the year, you will summarize what your payroll was. So the policy is initially written off of a projection for 12 months. At the end of that policy, they will audit it, and whatever your true payroll was, your premium will be trued up or down based off what that was. If you have a 1099, like a food truck that runs through your POS, you cut them a check on a 1099 every weekend or quarterly or whatever the agreement is that you have. Your work comp carrier is going to see that as an uninsured subcontractor. And if you can't line up that 1099 expense with a work comp certificate, you will see that premium added at audit. And so you don't want to have to run into that. The other I guess ramification that you consider with this is if you have vendors on site, like a food truck, like a pop-up merchandising tent, right? A band of all of the different vendors that you might find at a small festival. The risk that you run is that, depending on the state, some of those vendors could be seen as quote unquote employees should they get hurt on your premises, and they could theoretically file a claim under your policy if they don't have their own. So the other thing I will say on the poor record keeping, that last point, not allocating different duties under payroll. So workers' compensation can contemplate that an employee may fit into different classifications. So it is entirely possible, as far as the classifications go, and in just practically in running a brewery, that you may well have someone who splits their time between a clerical role, a sales role, and serving in the tap room, or maybe they're doing cellar work part-time and then they also work in the tap room. So the important thing to consider is that those duties carry different rates. A clerical rate is extremely cheap relative to a brewing rate. It could be as much of a 10 cents per hundred of payroll to $1.50 per $100 in payroll. And so at a 15x discrepancy, it's important to make sure that whatever the payroll is, it gets into the right classification. And if you are not tracking that on your books, then you can't allocate it out on your work comp policy either. So it's important to, if you have an employee, let's say, I'm just going to make up some numbers, let's say they make $15 an hour doing clerical work for you, and then on the weekends they work the tap room making $10 an hour. It's important that you are able to easily show that delineation in your payroll books so that you can get credit on your work comp policy for the period of time that they are doing clerical work. Because even if they do 90% clerical and 10% in the tap room, if you can't show that distinction, 100% of their payroll will fall under the more ambitious code. So something to keep in mind. Return to work. This is something that smaller breweries may not necessarily need this formalized, especially in those instances where you're a brewery owner that's wearing kind of all of the hats, right? So you are brewing. You may well just not have very much payroll. The payroll that you do have is maybe some limited tap room. So something like this, you don't necessarily need to formalize it in a situation like that. But those larger breweries, so I would say when you start getting up over, probably 5,000 barrels and you get some annually, and you get some of these larger operations, that's the time where you really want to firm this up and probably formalize this. And a return to work program is exactly what it sounds like, and it's also something that you can lean on your insurance carrier and your agent to help you craft. This is going to a proper return to work program will keep your overall work comp expenses low. And kind of from an ethical standpoint, it's important to have, because 50% of employees that don't return to work after 6 months typically don't return to work at all. And some of those may work elsewhere, but a lot of times, unfortunately, those employees, lean on disability. And so it's important to offer the return to work program because that gives them a much more viable path back to working, and working for you. Importantly, if they're a great employee, that's certainly something that you want to have happen. So that's the return to work. So let's talk about this last piece. And this piece gets a little bit contentious because I think the initial reaction as a business owner and a brewery owner when an agent suggests to you that you should pay claims out of pocket is kind of a WTF, like, this is why I have insurance. So why are you telling me not to make claims? But when you look at your insurance program kind of holistically, and especially from a work comp perspective, it often makes sense for small claims to be handled just out of pocket and just pay cash for them. And so I won't get into the other claim scenarios, but from a work comp standpoint, the importance with this is work comp underwriters, their favorite slogan is that frequency leads to severity. And the idea behind that is if there is a business who is consistently having claims, even if they're $500, I'd say, especially if they're $500, if they have a consistent string of claims, that's a tremendous red flag, and really poses questions about the brewery's safety culture. It poses questions overall about their business operations and their ability to run a business, and what that tells them, or what it scares them into thinking, is inevitably there will be a very large claim for this business because their operations are not tight. And so that's the concern here. Work comp claims. So one large claim will probably impact you as much or less than, say, a handful of small claims, especially if the large claim is purely an accident. I mean, that's the idea, is that accidents do happen. You could have the best safety culture in the world, and sometimes, shit is just going to happen. It's just kind of how it goes. And so the idea is that if you can protect your loss history from all of these other small claims, when that really fluky deal happens, that's the only thing that is on that loss history. And so that becomes a tool for you, for if you have a talented agent that should be able to take that and relay that narrative to underwriters to say, hey, look, their loss history is either clean because they're keeping these small claims from being reported, or they have just one incident that they couldn't control, that there was absolutely no instance. So that small claim threshold is going to be different for every brewery, based on your operations, based off of your cash flow. And the other thing to keep in mind here is this doesn't give you, say, a free pass to just not file comp claims. I'm not an attorney, but work comp law typically in states says that if you have an employee who suffers an injury such that they miss any work, a minute of work, I mean, theoretically, then you are required by law to notify the state that there's been a work comp incident. When you have a workers' compensation policy, so uh, with work comp being a statutory coverage, there has to be a formal reporter just on file with the state. And so when you have these large insurance programs, these large work comp programs or captives, right? Those captives represent that, or if you're self-insured, you become that mandatory reporter. But in most instances, with breweries, they're going to have what's called guaranteed cost, and they're going to have an insurance carrier who's going to pick up all of the costs, and that insurance carrier becomes the mandatory reporter. And so if you don't let your insurance carrier know of an incident because you intend to pay it out of pocket, you potentially run into some serious legal ramifications and likely some fees, as well as your insurance carrier. So it's a really good way to just create a bad situation. But so the key then is to file your work comp claim with the work comp carrier, but file it as notice only. What that does is it allows the carrier to be made aware of the claim, so that they can make the state aware, but letting them know that it's notice only means that you intend to pay that claim out of pocket. And that protects your loss history, and that protects your experience modification factor. And that experience modification factor, I think, will be the last thing I touch on this. If you're not aware of what that is, it's essentially a snapshot. It's a 3-year lagging snapshot of your loss history. So it doesn't include your current year. So let's say we had an insurance policy that ran January 1 of this year, 2021, to January 1 of 2022. That year would not be into consideration, and the prior year would not be under consideration, but the 3 years prior to that would. And they all go in, and it gets jumbled up, and it's not worth going into the math algorithm at this point because I couldn't explain it anyway. But it spits out essentially an experience mod, which starts at 1 is the default. Anything below 1 is good. Anything above. And if you have years upon years of clean losses or lower than expected losses for your industry, that number goes down and it gets applied to your work comp premiums, which can be huge. So for instance, if you have a 0.9 experience modification factor and your manual premium is $10,000, you apply a 0.9 to it, you get $1,000 off of your premium. So it does add up, and it is important to kind of protect that experience mod. But that is all I've got. So here's just kind of a summary of the 5 kind of common mistakes that I see, and some notes that go with it. My contact information is up there on the top. My email, that's my cell phone. Feel free to shoot me a text if that's easier than calling. And I'm also with the cool kids on LinkedIn. That's all I got. I think I'll wait here for a second to see if some questions come in. But otherwise, it's almost time to open a beer, I think. I like the enthusiasm. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out the screen share here. Again, there's my contact information, and you can find me on the CBP Facebook group as well. Feel free to reach out with questions and or compliments, or certainly criticisms. Open to it all. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and appreciate you guys. Thanks.